I thought this is our fourth of our series where we've been looking at the discussion and the dialogue around human sexuality. So we were able to split Clyde's discussion on Wednesday night and Charlie's discussion today. If you have missed any of them and you'd like to watch them, they are online. So make sure to go to our website and it will direct you to the right place. But I realize I've been remiss every time we've started, we haven't opened with prayer. So I should at least ask the presence of the Lord to continue to be with us. So join me in prayer. Oh, Holy One, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for the moisture that falls, for those who are here today, your body. We give you thanks for those who have presented, for their hard work, for their integrity, for their hearts. And we give you thanks for this struggle, that we can come together as a church and we can turn our hearts and our minds to you, and we can listen and we can speak with a sense of holy words. So as we share this last session, O Lord, open our hearts and center us on you, your message that reminds us that we are to love you and love our neighbor as ourselves. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Claire, and thank you for all being here on this frosty morning and for giving up maybe the first half of the Broncos game. Today we're going to cover part history lesson, part sociology lesson, part review of the legal developments in our U.S. society over the last 70 years. And the last part will be a review of the status of the United Methodist Church and how we operate and how we decide what to do going forward. I'll give a warning and an apology to start out. We're dealing with human sexuality and sex acts as they interact with both our legal system and also the church, we as human beings. So you may hear some words that you usually don't hear in church, and if so, don't kill the messenger. All right, let's take a look at ancient cultures. We have a difficult time going back through the ages, and I'm talking about thousands of years, because there really was not a word for homosexuality in ancient Greece or in ancient Egypt. But there are texts and there are images that show and talk about same-sex interaction, both in ancient Egypt and in ancient Greece. We also keep in mind that there was not a Jewish or Christian overlay or attitude in those cultures, so it's very difficult to take our mindset and apply it back to them. What we do know is that it was not part of their legal systems, but it was part of their society. And for us to take our Judeo-Christian background and put it onto that is very difficult for us to do. Let's look at some of the cultural developments in the United States. We'll go to the next one around. We're talking about things that have happened in our society. Many of you that look around the room may be close to me in age, and these are things that we lived through. So it's probably not anything that would surprise you, but it may just remind you of the developments that we've seen in our culture. Back in the 1950s, there arose a need for sex education for our young people to be in the schools. A big change in our society was the availability of contraception. Birth control pills began availability for the population in general in the 1960s. Then there was a big argument in the 1960s about whether sex education should be only abstinence or should talk to people about the medical aspects of interaction on a sexual basis. Some people thought, well, let's stick with the Christian way and say, don't do this. And others thought, oh, we need to show them how this works with our bodies. And others said, if we show them that, then it's going to encourage them to our society was the increase in divorce rates. In the 1950s, 2.5 couples per 1,000 had a divorce. That rose in the 1960s to 3.2, and in the 1970s to 5.3. That was something that happened, more than doubling of the divorce rate in our society over that 30-year period. Looking back at these things remind me of Bob Dylan. Remember that song? And you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, because the times they are a-changing. And I'm not kidding. The divorce rate today, the last number we had through 2017, is 2.9. So it took off for a ways and went up, and it's come back a little ways, but it's still higher than it was during the 1950s. Some people refer to this as the sexual revolution in our society. Let's look at the next one. Along with this, we had cultural developments that had to do with our legal system. Will you look at the next one, Ron?
I'm trying to advance it. Why isn't it going? I think I messed something up here. Where are we? This one. It's not playing. Slideshow. Okay. I don't know why it won't come to the next slide.
Sorry, what we're reading, is that 2.5 per 1,000 like ever, 1,000 marriages, or is that per year or something, you know?
It's averaged over a decade.
Over a decade?
Yeah, for each year there were a little bit different numbers, but they kept creeping up in each of those decades. So this is an average for the decade.
The decade, but it's, is it the number per year?
That's correct.
Number per year, thank you.
Okay. I think I got it.
Now we're cooking. I grew up in a town that was segregated. My father worked in the courthouse, and they had a water fountain for coloreds only, and a water fountain for whites, and bathrooms for colored, and bathrooms for whites. To tell my kids and my grandkids about that, they think that must have been 1,000 years ago. But that was the reality in the 1950s and the 1960s. I worked in the Congress in 1966, and one of the big arguments or presentations during that time, President Johnson was the president. He was trying to do many of the civil rights things. Voting Rights Acts had been changed, and we're looking in at housing and lodging and the ability for all citizens to have access to housing. And that was a big deal during the 60s. Homosexuals, or those that identified as lesbian and gay, also began to congregate more in communities because of their affinity for each other and their problems. And the Stonewall Inn riot at the end of 1969 brought this to focus in conflict with the police in New York City. It was the first time that the news media really broke out that the LGBTQ community was demanding a different deal from the government in their civil rights. Sexual relations were seen as the fulfillment of one's life potential, not just for procreation. That brought in singles having sex, divorced people having sex, and non-heterosexual identities having sex. And that mixed through our society during the late 60s into the 1970s. Yes, sir?
Stupid question. What does the Q stand for?
The Q depends on who you ask, but in some instances stands for questioning, and in others it stands for queer.
Okay.
When I was growing up, queer was a pejorative, that you called somebody that you thought was a sissy, and it was not something that anybody wanted to be called. But the community has taken that on more as a badge of honor and said that's not a bad word, and we're fine to identify ourselves as queer. So, depending on how you look at that, other people say they're not sure what their sexual identity is, and so they're questioning where they fit on that spectrum. We lived through all of this, women's liberation, more women entered the workforce, more women had access to economic resources. They didn't have to rely on their spouse. They had access to work that they may not have had 20, 30, 40 years before. And they had the personal potential to say, maybe this sex thing is not just for raising families. It may be a way for me to fulfill my human potential. Might even be fun and rewarding and satisfying. And that was a change in many people's attitude. Playboy magazine talked about free love and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We've all heard those things about what was going on during that period of time. Singles and divorced people also presented the dilemma for the church, because they would come to churches and seek some spiritual guidance, recognizing their own personal circumstances. And this was particularly aggravated in the divorced community. As people began, more and more people were divorced, but yet felt an affinity to the church. In the old days, the church would say, don't get divorced. The Catholic Church has continued to take a very severe stance on that. The Methodists are much more progressive or liberal in saying we welcome all people. But even the stigma, if you would, of being divorced was a big deal in the 50s and the 60s, and sometimes even into the 70s. The other thing that began to make concern here was that birth control allowed young people, teenagers, to have premarital sex. And a lot of people said we're going to have sex with each other before we get married, and that was contravening the long-held tradition of you want to be a virgin on your wedding night. Recreational sex, not necessarily with an affinity of loving someone, but just hooking up with someone, became more common. It was a means of personal gratification, and it was a personal right or privilege to experience one's full human potential, and that's the way many people looked at it. Let's look at the next one, Ron. There should be one that says, there we go.
I think I moved one back.
1973, the American Psychiatric Association dropped homosexuality as a disorder, and the minority status in our society began to include sexual identity, not just race or sex or ethnicity, nationality or religion. These all progressed in the 70s and 80s.
Is there a case law behind that, or is that just an assertion that you make?
I'm sorry?
Is there a case law behind that statement, or is that an assertion that you make?
That's an assertion. We're getting into the case laws that will reflect on much of this, and you'll see how that kind of develops. This was also reflected in women in the workplace were considered a minority, even though there were more women than there were men in the population. Women were considered a minority in the military, even though in our society there were more women than men. Men were considered a minority in teaching and nursing professions because they typically had not been in those. We all know the stories of the Irish, the Polish, the Italians, how they were considered minorities in America. The Jews, the Mormons, and the Jehovah's Witnesses, all considered minorities. We began to look at lesbians and gays as a minority group, and they began to identify themselves in that manner, and were demanding equal rights under the law and fairness in our society. Let's look next at the legal developments. We all know that this is a country founded on law. We believe in the rule of law. The Constitution of the United States is our founding document, lays out how we're going to govern ourselves, but it also contains a Bill of Rights that are reserved to the individuals. Sometimes the law follows societal changes, and sometimes society follows the legal changes. We'll see how that develops. We're going to talk about several of these cases, and depending on your reaction to them, it may tell you a little bit about how you feel, viscerally, emotionally, how you may be involved in this on the political side, not just on the legal side. In 1948, McCollum versus the Board of Education said that tax-supported public education could not aid in religious education based upon First Amendment to the Constitution, the separation of church and state. were prohibited to spend tax money to educate someone about religion. The next one, public segregation, is unconstitutional. Many of us lived through this. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 said that segregation, separate but equal schools, was not constitutional because on their face they were not equal, even though they were separate. This was based upon equal protection in the 14th Amendment, and it was a big change in our society from when the 14th Amendment was put in back in 1868. Because in 1868, throughout much of the South, there were no public schools. If you went to school, it was a private school, and often affiliated with the local church or diocese. By 1954, local, county, and state governments are very differently in the public education business. So our society changed over that 100-year period, and the law reflected that. Prayers required by government in public schools were ruled unconstitutional in 1962. Engel versus Vitale, the state had written what they considered to be a non-denominational prayer, and it was required to be read every morning in school. The court said that this violated the First Amendment of Establishment of Religion and was prohibited. School-sponsored Bible reading in public schools declared unconstitutional in 1963. Abington School District versus Shemp. State-sponsored Bible reading in school violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment, making it applicable to the states. Life magazine in 1964 had a circulation of millions of Americans. And they declared Madeline Murray O'Hare, the mother of the defendant in this case, the most hated woman in America because she was a noted atheist and she did not want her son to have to read the Bible. Let's look at the next one. The right to use birth control just for married people in 1965. Griswold versus Connecticut said, it prohibited any drug and its use for the purpose of preventing conception. That strikes me as really strange, but that was the law back in 1965 when I was in high school. The right to privacy, declared by the Supreme Court of the United States, said that any government intrusion to this right of privacy was wrong, and that this right to privacy, though not specifically mentioned in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, grew out of other rights that were granted. The Fourth Amendment that says the law cannot break into your house without a warrant. They can't search your property. The Fifth, which says you have a personal right not to incriminate yourself. And the Ninth, which allows all the other rights that are not enumerated to be held by individuals. So those that weren't enumerated fell to do it. And the 14th Amendment made this applicable to all of the states. This right to privacy that the Supreme Court mentioned in this 1965 case becomes more important as you see the subsequent decisions as we move forward. This last one, all I have to say is Roe versus Wade. And you all have a reaction. Pro, con, up, down, sideways, whatever. And it's not something that most people can sit and discuss amicably. I have difficulties with my sisters because we're on opposite sides of that issue. Most of us know people, good-hearted, decent, loving people that have different opinions from us on abortion. This grew out of the right to privacy, that personal right that was mentioned earlier, belonging to a woman to make these decisions for herself without undue hindrance by the government. What's interesting here, because I have a history degree, that in Roe versus Wade, Henry Wade was the district attorney in Dallas. And he's most noted for prosecuting Jack Ruby, who killed what's his name, Lee Harvey Oswald, who killed John F. Kennedy. So most of us lived through that. And Henry Wade, I think, would rather be known for prosecuting Jack Ruby than for being the defendant in Roe versus Wade. Let's look at the next one. Sodomy laws prohibiting same-sex activity were unconstitutional in 2003. Lawrence versus Texas was the case that came to the Supreme Court and brought this to our minds. What stunned me in this research is that in 1960, all 50 states had laws prohibiting what they called sodomy. Sodomy was defined very differently depending upon each state. It often said deviant sexual behavior. Sometimes it involved oral, sometimes anal, sometimes masturbation, sometimes prostitution, sometimes fornication, sometimes bestiality, and sometimes all of those in the same statute. It usually was applied in the legal system on male-to-male sexual activity. I found very few instances where women were charged with this. And that's a reflection of our society looking at male homosexual activity, I think, in a different lens than we might from females. The court said that this is a violation of due process. It violates the right of people to privacy, and that the court, the legal system, has no business coming into someone's house where they have private, consensual, adult behavior. It didn't prohibit laws that say older people messing with children is still prohibited, but same-sex consensually adults was not something that the law would back. Gays were allowed in the U.S. military service in 2010. This was a repeal of the don't ask, don't tell policy of the Clinton presidential years when that law was repealed, and the new law went into effect in 2011, said that gays could serve in the military. The third one down, same-sex marriage became legal in 2015. Obergefell versus Hodges said the right to marry applies to same-sex, due process, equal protection, a fundamental right to individuals as all others. This was a combination of legal cases that were consolidated before the Supreme Court. And the real issue was, if you were married under the laws of Massachusetts, which allowed same-sex marriage, and you moved to Arkansas, could you then have that marriage recognized by the state of Arkansas, which did not allow same-sex marriage? And the court said, yes, the states had to recognize the same-sex marriage for inheritance of property, for your inheritance of your monies and all of those things, as well as ownership of property. I think we skipped one. Ron, can we go back and look at, I think it's slide number 9.
I might have moved one accidentally. What is it supposed to say?
One right before this. Is there not one after this one?
I might have moved one accidentally. I don't know.
If it's not there, I can talk about it.
Yeah, I don't see it. What's supposed to be on that slide?
There should be one right before that, I believe.
That's the only one that I have is this one here, which we talked about.
Yeah, there we go. Right to use birth control of married couples. There we go. In the chronology, this comes a little bit earlier. I apologize for skipping this. The right to use birth control for married couples in 1965 allowed us to do that. The second one there, miscegenation, that's a big fancy word that says you cannot marry between races. Primarily white people marrying black people. But it also applied to Hispanics and or Asians or anybody else that kind of got locked into that. Interracial marriage was declared unconstitutional in 1967. Evolution. also offended some religious people because they didn't believe in teaching our kids something other than what was found in the Bible about the creation of the earth, even though science and all of the people studying that said this is something people need to know and understand. Epperson versus Arkansas in 1968 required the teaching of evolution and to go by the biblical manner, but prohibited any other discussion about evolution because it offended people's religious sensibilities. Science and religion here clashed with the local communities that wanted the Bible, essentially, in its theories taught in their public schools. This violated the First and the 14th Amendment. The fourth one there is a birth control available to all. That meant unmarried people. Believe it or not, there were laws that said single people could not have access to birth control or contraception. That was declared unconstitutional in 1972. And then Roe versus Wade, the mother of all disputes. Thank you, Ron, for going back and picking those up. We're talking about things that the cultural and legal developments impact the church. And all of us good thinking people in the religious community identify this.
You missed one of the ones about conversion therapy. What's conversion therapy?
I'm sorry,
You missed the last one there on conversion
the
therapy.
last bullet point on this slide,
Yeah, we're just.
Colorado was among the 18 states banning conversion therapy.
What's conversion therapy?
Conversion therapy is essentially the family, the persons, the institutions providing therapy for a homosexual person to change away from that orientation. That if I decided I was gay and my parents didn't like that, they could force me or encourage me or put me into different conversion therapy remedies. Usually they involve religious organizations. Prayer, we're going to pray this out of you and we're going to have you change. We're going to convert you from being gay to being straight. Most scientific and medical people say this is harmful. And the state of Colorado last year banned conversion therapy as part of our legal system in Colorado. All right. These developments impact the church. I have to use some definitions here so we know who we're talking about. And it's essentially going to be one side or the other side, and you'll understand a little bit how we get into this. Evangelical really means anyone who wants to spread the gospel. That could be and should be all of us. Good, faithful Christians that think we should tell others the good news of Christ. But in today's society, evangelicals has taken on a different meaning. Conservatives, traditionalists, fundamentalists, orthodox, or confessing are different words that can be used to go with evangelicals. Generally, this is not across the board, but as a general statement, evangelicals are anti-abortion. They're anti-same-sex unions. And they're against ordaining in a church lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning individuals. They see sexuality as a moral issue based solely on the literal, eternal, immutable word or law of God, and they support Bible literalism. What it says is what it means, is much their attitude about the Bible verses. In our popular media, you hear this many times about Christian evangelicals, and that somehow divides that part of the Christian faith community from another part of the Christian faith community. Some of these you'll recognize as supporters of what we call evangelicals. The Christian right, moral majority, focus on the family, the Christian Coalition, Jerry Falwell, Oral Roberts, Pat Robertson, James Dobson. What's interesting from a society's and sociological look is how politics become involved in all of this. In 2004, George W. Bush received 28% of the white evangelical Christian voters. 28%. In 2016, Donald Trump received 81% of the white Christian evangelical voters. That shows you how the political side of this has jumped into what we usually think of as a dispute within the church. Let's go to the next one. The beliefs for evangelicals are typically, and again, this is generally, not everyone across the board, but they generally believe that the understanding and application of Scripture is based on 2,000 years of Christian tradition. Only male and females were created by God, and that the norm is heterosexual relations, and that there is no theological basis for physiological identity other than one's birth sex. And you cannot change they do not support a sex change operation. The LGBTQ spectrum, our people tend to look at this as a spectrum. From one end of your sexuality being totally female and the other being totally male, and somewhere in between. We've all known people that we thought men who were effeminate or sensitive or compassionate, or we used to call queer, that may have been heterosexual, but because of some of the things that we saw from their persona, led us to believe maybe they were a little on the different side of that. That spectrum is taken into account by all of the LGBTQ community to say it's not male or female, but many of us fall into different spots along this line. The next one talks about evangelicals believe that the Bible is inerrant, including scientific and historical information. You can go to the Grand Canyon and take a Christian evangelical fundamentalist tour that tells you all of this happened in the last 8,000 years, because that's a literal reading of the creation of the world. There are people who say the Bible is true, and I don't want to hear any of the scientific or historical arguments that go against that. Evangelicals believe that marriage is sanctioned by God. It joins one man and one woman, and this is the sole context for sexual intimacy. They believe that God's design for living prohibits certain acts. Same-sex sexual behavior is the top of that list. Failure to follow God's law brings punishment and retribution. That there is a punishment part of God's standards. Let's look at the next one. Evangelicals also believe that efforts to go against God's will, or word, or law, means that you're changing the rules to meet society's dictates. They believe others, that being essentially progressives, are biblically illiterate and therefore subject to changing theology as society changes. They believe that their values are grounded biblically and inspired by generations of faithful Christians. And they believe that the church rules show our covenant with each other and that all of us must be accountable. This is particularly applicable to our conference and the General Conference of the United Methodist Church, because our conference has a gay bishop, and we've said we're fine with that. There are others that say, wait a minute, the Book of Discipline says you shouldn't have a gay bishop, and therefore you should be held accountable for this action. It's a reflection of modern moralism, the church of what's happening now. That others say the progressives just don't know how to read the Bible. It's very plain and straightforward, and you should believe what it says. Others say it's kind of the old-time religion. It worked for centuries, why should we change it? And the church rules through the Book of Discipline are really to be followed, not to be flouted or ignored. Let's look at the other side. The progressives Depending on how you look at that, they're called liberals, reconciling, modernists, affirming. Generally, they are pro-choice, support same-sex unions, and favor the ordaining of LGBTQ persons. They see biblical interpretation through philosophical, historical, scientific, and cultural lenses. They are come to be called many different names, but they tend to be upper to upper middle class. They're likely to have college degrees, and they typically vote Democrat. Some of the names you'll recognize for the progressive movement are Jim Wallace and the Sojourners, Charles Toy, the Christian Left, Interfaith Alliance, Progressive Christian Alliance, Marcus Borg, and John Shelby Spong. Let's look at the next one. The progressives believe that they support biblical criticism, and that is not to be critical of the truth in the Bible, but to use analytical methods to critique the data at hand, to use these philosophical, historical, cultural lenses to try to pull out of the scripture what it really means to us today. And they call that biblical criticism. They believe there's growing evidence that sexual orientation is not a choice. They believe that sexuality is non-binary, that it tends to be a spectrum. It's not male or female based upon your birth sex. And they apply modern concepts of science, biology, genetics, must apply as we look at human sexuality. The next one, the progressive believe that loving, faithful, homosexual relations of today are not an option in biblical times. And so the clobber passages that Paul walked us through that first night do not apply because they were applicable to a much different time and culture. They believe that sexual misconduct in the Bible is not limited to same-sex relations. In fact, there are many more condemnations of heterosexual misconduct than there are for homosexual. And that efforts to change one's sexual orientation do not work and usually cause harm. This is that conversion therapy that we mentioned and talked about. Let's look at the next one. The progressives believe that the Book of Discipline for the United Methodist Church, the language of sexual intimacy to be expressed only in a marriage between a man and a woman, should be changed to reflect our beliefs and our society. They believe that marriage is not defined by gender, but by covenantal values of sacredness, fidelity, permanency, and monogamy. If two men said they wanted to commit their lives to each other in a sacred ceremony and pledged fidelity and said this is a permanent relationship and we will be faithful to each other, the progressives were okay with that. They feel that it is wrong for the Book of Discipline to list, among any other things, being a self-avowed, practicing homosexual, or conducting homosexual unions or performing same-sex marriages as immoral. The Book of Discipline sets this out in a long paragraph, and it starts out and says essentially that people in the church, ordained by the church, should not have immorality, and then it says, including but not limited to, and it begins to list all of these things that include self-avowed, practicing homosexual, conducting these marriages. The next one, these developments come to the church. So we've seen the progressives, and we've seen the liberals, and we've seen the traditionalists, and we've seen the evangelicals kind of split from a society and a historical legal situation, and we're all part of the same church. Our church includes people with some or all of the characteristics that I've identified or noted, some on both sides, some on one side more than the other. Some can see both sides, some are strict on one side and don't want to hear from the other side. On a personal note, I sometimes think God was preparing me my whole life to give this presentation. I have a history degree from Baylor University. You may know that is the largest Southern Baptist university in the world. They believe in the old-time religion, and I have 20 credits from Baylor University in religious instruction according to the Southern Baptist Church. They are definitely on the evangelical, traditionalist, fundamentalist side. I have a law degree from the University of Denver. That, in my opinion, was very liberal leaning in their view toward personal rights and the abuse of the government versus those personal rights. When I was in law school, we had demonstrations every week against the Vietnam War. And many of us in the law school were right out there in the middle of it. On a personal experience, I've been a lifelong Methodist. I grew up in the Methodist Church. And my father was a delegate to the General Conference in 1972 in Atlanta when this clause was put into the Book of Discipline. Of all the things I regret, one of those is not being able to sit down with my father and discuss this with him. Because as I read through this, I wished I could sit down and just talk to my dad. I talked to my sisters about it this past couple of weeks, and all they remembered my dad saying was, "It's a mess." And it's still a mess after all these years. Much of what you're going to hear moving forward as to how we got there and the things that have developed in the church come from this book, Entangled. And the professor who wrote it is Ashley Bogan Dreff. And it's primarily directed towards the developments in the Methodist Church from 1968 through today. And it's a good, I think, fair-minded explanation of both sides. So let's take a look at the next one. Developments in the United Methodist Church. We're going to look at the basic principles for how we run our church. Evangelicals and progressives agree on the authority of the Scriptures. They believe that it's God's truth revealed over the ages. They agree that God is love, but they disagree on whether love conquers punishment or retribution. Some believe that God is love, but God has standards. And if you violate those standards, there should be an accountability. They agree that each side believes their interpretation of the Scripture is valid. And that's sort of like the political dispute over all these issues. They disagree that one interpretation of Scriptures relating to human sexuality fits all. So we have good, loving Christians on one side and good, loving Christians on the other side, and we all end up in the same church. The next one talks about the General Conference, and many of you know that the General Conference is the legislative body of the worldwide Methodist Church, and they meet every 4 years. The good news is that we are part of a group that believes in representative democracy. We elect delegates to go to the conference and tell them what we think and how we should govern ourselves. The bad news about the Methodist Church is we're part of a representative democracy. We get all sides on all of this. If you think about the sociological review of the things that we've talked about, the Methodist Church, in my opinion, was a little late in coming to the party to say full ordination of women should be allowed. That did not happen until 1956, even though women were granted the right to vote back in 1990. Elders in the church, which is essentially Pastor Clare, were not allowed until 36 years after that women were given votes. In 1968, the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church joined together to form the United Methodist Church. Sexuality was not discussed at that point. Segregation was a bigger issue. We had black churches and we had white churches, and they both had Methodists over the there. So homosexuality was essentially kicked down the road. A commission was formed in 1968 to report to the next General Conference in 1972, revising the social principles and develop a stance on human sexuality to be included in the Book of Discipline and the social principles. Let's look at the next one. In 1972, the General Conference added this paragraph on human sexuality. It was added after what I consider to be sort of chaotic sessions at the General Conference. The Sexuality and Social Principles and Book of Discipline report was brought to the convention, but there was a dispute amongst those preparing the report as to whether the entire report should be recommended for approval or it should be broken up into different pieces. One of the pieces that was taken out dealt with the human sexuality. What that allowed then was for these issues to come to the conference floor for debate, amendment, deletion, addition, whatever, to end up with them. So the 4 years of work by this commission on sexuality sort of gets pushed aside, and the fight comes to the conference floor in 1972. This is what we've been fighting about for those years. The incompatibility clause was added in 1972. Though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this teaching incompatible with Christian doctrine. The person that made this amendment from the floor that ended up being approved was interviewed some 20 years later, and he admitted that the reason he felt so strong about this was that he felt older men preyed on younger men, and if homosexuals are allowed in the church, we are opening ourselves up for all kinds of pedophilia or abuse in our children. And he felt very strongly about that. The incompatibility clause starts by saying, we insist that homosexuals are entitled to have their human and civil rights ensured, comma, though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this teaching incompatible with Christian doctrine. So the last part of that sentence is where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion. Let's look at the next one. After intense lobbying by both sides, in 1976, the incompatibility clause was affirmed. There were several studies back and forth. By 1980, some of the original fears that drove this being included were abated, and many people understood that maybe there weren't any more homosexual men preying on children than there were heterosexual men preying on children. That because you're homosexual didn't mean you had a proclivity to want to attract children to your stance. The incompatibility clause remained, but the ban on gay organization was defeated in 1980. In those days, the social principles were essentially ways we intended to live our life, but they were not seen as binding on the church. And then confusion ensued. Some conferences defrocked gay ministers, others ordained them. So the split went further down through the church. In 1984, language was added that said, self-avowed, practicing gays and lesbians are prohibited from all steps of ordination. That meant it's improper, based upon these rules, to ordain a gay or lesbian minister. Let's look at the next one. 1988, the incompatibility clause was softened a little bit. We affirm God's grace is available to all, and we commit ourselves to be in ministry for and with all persons. But the other language remained. In 1992, another study on human sexuality was brought to the General Conference, and we added language regarding gay rights under the law, but no change to the prior language in the church documents. And we added officiating at a same-sex marriage they left it to the pastor's discretion. It was essentially local option. By 1966, officiating or using church property for same-sex marriage was prohibited by the General Conference, and the church trials followed it for the ministers who did those things. The actions against ministers have stirred up a lot of personal resentment and animosity and emotion, as you might imagine. In many cases, they are people from other conferences filing charges against somebody, say in your conference, that they feel violated these rules. Whether they knew the person or were touching their lives or not, it didn't matter. They felt that person was violating the church rules. So let's look at the next one. This dispute became more and more evident, and the evangelicals were pretty fed up with what they saw the liberal leanings of the church, and they threatened to propose an amicable split back in 2004. But they sensed that the delegates at the General Conference would not support it, and so they withdrew that petition. 2008, 2012, 2016 General Conferences, the opposing sides continued to clash. The incompatibility clause remained. And to my regret, many of the sides began calling names of the other side that were not very Christian-like. So the lines were drawn and hardened, in my opinion, in many ways. In 2016, the General Conference formed a study group to bring forth new ways for the United Methodists to exist together despite these differences. So we recognized the problem and wanted to address that. Let's look at the next one. That led to the Special General Conference for 2019 to consider the ways forward. As you may well know, the traditional plan, most conservative plan, was adopted. It reinforced the current language, strengthened enforcement for violations, and provided a process for leaving the United Methodist Church. 2020 General Conference, which is next May, to consider plans to either stay together or split into separate churches, or to have an umbrella for all, but yet different divisions underneath that. We hope that it'll show a bridge for a divide. We hope that it'll give some clarity what we had hoped, need to do, or want to do, or desire to do to live into our Christian mission. But right now, we're a little bit waiting to see what those plans are approved and how the General Conference approves all that. Let's look at the next one. This is how the 2020 General Conference delegates will break down. 55.9% from the U.S., and you think initially, well, that's more than half, we're all think alike. But 62% of that 55.9% comes from the South Central and the Southeast conferences. If you look at the map, it's we're going to start in Florida, in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, come across to Tennessee and Kentucky, become Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Those states tend to be more conservative. They tend to be more traditionalist. They tend to be more evangelical. And they vote that way. They've also gotten organized and have, in my view, made efforts to bring along the African General Conferences and their delegates with them to go with much of what the South Central and the South conferences promote. If you look at 32% from Africa, you can tell that to get a majority, you're going to need some of the African votes. But as we discussed earlier, in many countries in Africa, it is against the law to be a homosexual. So no self-respecting Methodist preacher is going to stand up and say, this is wrong, we're going to do something about it, because they could be arrested or accused of promoting homosexuality, which is against the law. Many of the African churches also have a very fundamental approach to what the Bible says is what it means. And they're not open to many of the more liberal or progressive ways of looking at all of this. The Philippines and the European conferences add up the rest of that. But the big issues come from the southeast and southern parts of the United States versus the north central, and the western jurisdiction, and then how the Africans vote. But the U.S. delegates have gone down, and the Africans have gone up, and the Philippines have gone up. So many of the progressive side are looking at just the numbers of people who will be at the General Conference and are not encouraged in being able to get their idea or their agenda passed through the General Conference. It's going to require, in my opinion, some kind of compromise, and whether the two sides are willing to do that and what it looks like if you were to exit remains to be seen. If you look at 13.5 million Methodists around the world, nearly 7 million of those are in the United States. But we're split between evangelicals and progressives. 5.4 million of those are in Africa and growing, and they tend to vote on the evangelical side. And Europe and the Philippines are sort of a mixed bag. The Philippines are more conservative, the Europeans are a little more liberal. So the direction of the church and how it is growing in the global sense portends that the progressives are going to have a difficult time changing some of the things that we've talked about in the book of discipline or in the social principles. Now, if you have any more questions, now's the time to bring them up. And Pastor Claire, I'll turn it over to you.
If there are questions, I might just have you speak into we're videoing it, so I'll bring it to you if you have a question. Questions?
So what does this mean as far as they won't be able to change the book of discipline? Does this mean there'll be a split in the United Methodist Church to those who are more progressive, to those who are conservative, and where would Hope United Methodist stand in this?
Thank you, Stan.
There are, in order to do anything, we're going to have some vote at General Conference. So a couple weeks ago when Annie presented and shared about dismantling was the word that she used in terms of our denomination. The reality is when you talk to delegates, and by the way, we did an excellent job of explaining the delegates. We in Mountain Sky, which is Yellowstone and Rocky Mountain, have, I didn't bring my phone, I think we have 4 delegates who vote at General Conference. The conference I came from in Virginia, I don't know what they have now, but they had 53. So you can see the disparity of our voting power, if you will. In the Western jurisdiction, it doesn't even make up 53 compared to one conference. But the reality is that we can't just willy-nilly go splitting around and jumping here and there. We're very methodical, thank God. And so it is believed at the next General Conference that there will be a split. That said, the way in which different groups have gone about presenting legislation is different. So right now there are 2 main legislative plans. One is called the Indianapolis Plan. I spent an hour last week with one of our delegates, Kent Ingram. He serves down in Colorado Springs, just the 2 of us, and he answered every one of my questions. And he believes that the Indianapolis Plan has the best possibility to pass because, and I've got a copy of it if you really are interested, it's about 19 pages, because they brought to the table for several days traditionalists, centrists, and progressives. So it's the only plan that was written with all 3 voices at the table. The other plan is called the UMC Next legislative plan. The head of that plan is Adam Hamilton from Church of the Resurrection. He also was part of the Indianapolis plan, so he wears double hats. The thing that the UMC Next plan did not do is have the traditionalists sit at the table. The belief is with the Indianapolis plans is while there will be a split, and I'm going to read you the language because I think it's helpful, especially with your questions, Stan. It talks about that we will have loose connection. And so the split is not within the United Methodist trademark, that we are still trademarked United Methodist, but there are two essentially United Methodist brands, that's my word. The Traditionalist United Methodist Church will be a global, this is straight from the plan, by the way, will be a global denomination that will maintain the current stance of the United Methodist discipline regarding the practice of homosexuality. The centrist United Methodist Church would also be a global denomination that would remove from the discipline the incompatibility clause and prohibitions against same-sex weddings, ordination, and appointments. What's interesting is that annual conferences can vote. If you think of these two loosely connected United Methodist expressions, or Wesleyan expressions of the United Methodist Church, annual conferences can vote to be part of the traditionalist plan. If an annual conference doesn't vote in the United States, this is the United States, they will by default be in the centrist plan. The Central Conference, which is what you did such a good job explaining, Charlie, the Central Conference can vote, follow me, to be in the centrist plan, but if they choose not to vote, by default will be in the traditionalist plan. So they're trying to align like-mindedness, if you will. What has come to be reality after General Conference 2020 is that while the traditionalist plan has the number of votes, it does not have the power to legislate. So in other words, bishops aren't going to press charges and follow through with the process. People are going to continue to ignore the discipline. And so what the traditionalist plan, and also at the annual conferences, people voted into delegation a more centrist and progressive delegation across every annual conference. So they're realizing going into annual conference 2020 that while they're still going to probably have the vote, they're not going to have the ability to legislate. And even within our own annual conference, we have some who are very much a part of the traditionalist plan, and they have even said, we don't want to be, this to Bob Kaler, if you know Bob Kaler, he serves Tri-Lakes, and he's I love Bob. And he said at a meeting, and excuse my language, but this was Bob's language, he said, we sort of look like assholes. That's what he said. And he's part of very much a part of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, very, very much a part of his heart. And he said, I'm tired of us all looking like that. And just like you said, I think both sides have sort of looked like a-holes. So they're really trying to come to the table. The sticking point for the difference in the Indianapolis plan and the UM Next plan, which this is there are two big sticking points. Because remember, something's going to be voted. Something has to be voted. But one of the biggest sticking points is the UM Next plan includes a moratorium on all new and pending complaint proceedings related to the implementation of the 2019 Traditionalist Plan. The Indianapolis Plan does not. So that's been a little bit of a sticking point among they left the discussion with not having agreement. The Traditionalists still believe that those charges should stand as charged, and the UM Next is saying they want the moratorium. The other sticking point is money. And so that's always going to be a question of, and according to the Indianapolis plan, all local church property, assets, and liability will continue to belong to that local church. So if you stay within the centrist, which is really, if you think about it, 78% of our United Methodist churches in the United States fall in the centrist, where you have traditional compatibilists, and you have progressive compatibilists, and you have that moderate in between. That's where they would fall. And so we would stay within the denomination. So we would not have to vote as a church. If the annual conference voted, for example, to form a whole new alignment and a whole new expression of the denomination, then each local church has to vote. And it's actually in the Indianapolis plan says a simple majority is what you have to vote in order to make a decision on whether you're going to stay or go. Justin? You may have to come up here. I don't know if I can.
So when I listen to both of those plans, they both sound like they're just kicking the can down the road to me. Maybe they're not, but they sound like it. Now, I'm just not really politically, so I give it to them as well. But could you comment on that? I mean, obviously, we've been kicking the can for what, since 72? We're going to kick the can another 30 years? It looks stupid for another 30 years?
The difference is, and maybe you can help me answer this, Charlie, or Jerry, if you heard, the difference is that there would be a very clear delineation between a group who says clearly, we believe that the language in the discipline stays, and we're going to follow that discipline. So there'd be two different disciplines. So here's group A, if you will, being very simplistic. And so they're going to follow that discipline. So if you vote yourself into that denomination, that expression of the Wesleyan tradition, then you're able to, then you're no longer resisting and ignoring the discipline. So you've kept that language. Group B over here has changed the language. So instead of resisting and ignoring and breaking the law, if you will, church law, they're actually following church law. So it for the first time gives different expressions with loose connection, whereas right now we're a global church with all having to live under this one broad church law that we're really not able to, that we're not agreeing on. So I don't know.
I would disagree with that statement. I think they will make a decision that this is the plan, and then we, either as a local church or an annual conference, will have to decide which way we want to go. I think it won't be kicked 4 more years down. I think it's like, this is the plan. Do you want to stay or do you want to go?
When you say you want to go, you're still thinking of Methodist. So if I'm a traditionalist, let's say that I'm a traditionalist.
Right.
If I'm a traditionalist and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to go and now I think homosexuality is bad and I'm not going to indulge all the stuff the traditionalists think. And I see that the church across the road is not traditionalist, but they're still calling themselves United Methodists. I'm going to be pissed because my neighbor, who's a Catholic, is saying, well, you Methodists, you're okay with gay people. Well, no, I'm not. I mean, that's what's going to happen if I'm hearing you correctly. And maybe I'm hearing you incorrectly.
I believe that some of the proposals are much along that line. And a good example, in my opinion, is the Anglican Church. The Anglican churches went through this, talked about this, and they essentially have an umbrella group they call the Anglican Communion. That says most of this you agree with, but you kind of go your separate ways on some of these issues. And that's the pattern I think that this plan is looking for the messenger. I think we'd be open to that criticism that if we still call it a Methodist church, you're going to get painted with one side of that brush or the other, depending on what other people think of you. But it's an effort, in my view, to sort of keep the Methodist church together, at least in some sense, but to give these divided factions a way to coexist.
I think it says in the Indianapolis plan, and this sort of makes me giggle, but it says that their United Methodist Church may have an appropriate modifier if they so choose. It's so United Methodist of us. So there may be, like, I think of when the Lutheran Church really started having different modifiers in terms of ELCA or Missouri Synod Lutheran or the different.
So, does this mean there'll be other language,
It means that yes, yeah, it would be removed or kept. At this point, that's what the Indianapolis plan is recommending, it, to keep the clause or to remove the clause. So, yeah. So there would be different disciplines that you were allowed to follow.
Churches keep the same book of discipline, now that you won't.
One church would have the traditionalist plan, would have the book of discipline in its current form, and the centrist church would have the exclusion clause removed. So that's what's being proposed. Yeah.
So I think you said as an annual conference you would vote on where you fell in the Indianapolis plan. So either you would be more progressive or more traditionalist. But what about those churches that don't want to be progressive, but they're in an annual conference that by the majority votes to be progressive? Can they move to a different jurisdiction then?
At the end of the day, the local church is where the power is. So you can have the annual conference. I'm reading directly from this because I'm not good at memorizing any of this. The annual conference in the United States would decide by a simple majority of those annual conference members present. So Jane is our voting delegate with which denomination to align. Central conference, and it says annual conference is not making a decision, would become part of the centrist United Methodist Church by default, as I was sharing, which removes the exclusion language. Central conferences, which includes primarily Asia, Philippines, Russia, European, and Africa. Central conferences would decide by a simple majority vote of those members present and voting with the denominational. Central conferences that do not make a decision would become part of the traditionalist United Methodist plan by default. Local churches disagreeing with their annual conference's decisions can decide by a simple majority vote of a church conference to align with a different denomination. All local church property, assets, and liability will continue to belong to that local church. Does that answer? I don't think there's a lot more about, and then interestingly, like the UMW, those kinds of things become 501c3s, and you're encouraged to support them by your own choice. Yeah, Justin, sorry, come on up here. I'm not going to throw it over Chris and Cindy.
Would there then be two separate annual conferences moving forward, one for the centrist and one for the conservative, or?
You mean
General conference. That I don't know, to be honest. I didn't read that deep into the, but I'll tell you what, I'll give you a copy of this and you can read your heart's desire. So.
I believe that's right. That is my understanding. And what I would see is a realignment of the annual conference. Right now we're part of the Mountain Sky, right, annual conference. But if a church out in Springfield, Colorado said, we want to stick with the traditionalist plan, they might leave the Mountain Sky Conference and join Oklahoma or Northwest Texas or some other conference that was more of the traditional style.
And then there would be two separate general conferences, one for the traditionalists, one for the centrists.
Sure, because we're still under the loosely United Methodist, I don't know that. But that seems logical, but I can't promise logic.
I don't know the answer to that.
But I promise, I really do think if you, there's about 19 pages, Justin, I think you find that answer here. Yeah. I just don't want the people listening not to miss the question.
It seems confusing how you would vote. If you not vote, you automatically go into this one conference. What's the ramifications as far as owning the assets of the church for not voting compared to voting to make a change?
I think that we're trying to get ahead of ourselves, Stan. We don't know. And honestly, I think right now the question is going to be whatever plan is going to pass. Then we will have, as Andy said, at least, remember, General Conference is in May of 2020. annual conference is in June, so a month is almost no time at all. So it's hard to imagine that we're going to have our acts together to do anything in June 2020. My guess is June 2021 is when we'll have our vote, whatever it may be, if there is a needed. But we may just by default not vote and be in the centrist conference. I'm simply pontificating. That is not what. And honestly, Kent Ingram, who is our delegate, he's one of the voting clergy delegates, has great hope that the Indianapolis plan has some momentum because there have been at the table all of the voices. There's some arguing going on, which happens in everything, about it didn't have the right conservatives and the right liberals, which happens in politics all the time, right? So Ken disagrees with that, and because he's the voice for our conference, I'm listening to what he's saying. He really does believe that we had a good representation of individuals and has been in deep conversation with delegates across the globe. So he feels somewhat confident that this Indianapolis plan will give us a chance to be loosely connected and to be able, the sticking point of the moratorium on the charges is one big thing, and then the money is going to be the other thing. So, yeah. One last thing, and I know we're dwindling, but Annie presented a number of 92% of churches were in agreement with dismantling. I think I'm correct in how she worded it. And 8% they believed would stay with the traditionalist plan. That's really not a fair number. What that vote came from at annual conference was they put together a team called the Pathways team, and Jane was there. And there was a vote to say that we're going to resist the traditionalist plan, that we're not going to put charges into place. And we are affirming to put together a team to look at how to move forward. 92% of the delegates at annual conference said, yes, we are not affirming the traditionalist plan, and we want pathways to go forward. That isn't saying that 92% of churches would then disaffiliate or dismantle. I think that probably when I was talking to Kent, he thought it was more like 35% of churches at this point, and like I've talked to many of you about, we don't even have a plan to know where we're going, so it's not a great question to be asking.
So at annual conference, obviously, there were a lot of discussions on this, and we heard from both sides, and both sides, nobody's happy. So even though the traditionalist plan was passed, they're still not happy. So nobody is happy. So the only way that they see a way forward at that particular point in time, because we didn't have the Indianapolis plan or these plans, was that we're going to dismantle and we're each side going to form our own church. So, I mean, that was everybody at the table was saying, neither one of us. We had somebody who was from the Wesleyan Covenant. We had somebody that was an elder, an ordained elder, who is part of the LGBTQ community, and they were both saying, we love each other, but we don't agree on this. So let's come to the table and figure out the adult way to break apart and, go on serving Jesus the way that we feel called to serve Jesus.
Any other questions or thoughts, Clyde?
Not very sure.
Sure. It can be as long as you want.
Well, sure. So I just want to know, in these plans, can we put a link on the site or the plans themselves such that people can go look at them if they want to?
Yeah, I just sent today, Leah Beth, the link to the Indianapolis plan, and then I have an overview of the UM Next plan, so I need to find a link to the full plan. So
Isn't it the Mountain Sky Conference?
I couldn't find it there. I looked.
You can never find anything.
I know, so if I went to the mountain, you'd think the Mountain Sky website has a lot about our delegation, so you can see about delegation, but they're not being very transparent about the plans. And there's a lot of back and forth about the Indianapolis plan, to be honest. A lot of people despise it and some love it, so it's just the way it is with everything. So. Any other questions or any other comments that you want to add to the discussion? Jerry, do you have anything to add since you were part of, you were a delegate, I hate to call you out as in the history of this. You were a delegate in '84, right?
I was a delegate to 3 different general conferences.
Okay.
What we really need is a collaborative divorce. I have a daughter in town who's a lawyer, who was elected, who was recommended as a super attorney. Her practice is family practice, and she pushes a collaborative divorce. We have to compromise, and taking a vote's not going to make the difference. I'm sorry, I wish you would. It'll not only be conferences, it will not only be jurisdictions, it will be local churches. So no matter what the conference might vote, it will come down to the fact that some people in this church will go A, other people will go B. I'm still going to meet you at the grocery store. I'm still going to live across the street from you. I'll still play bridge with you every now and then. So let's not separate and decide to go, where. So let's just recognize that we've got to go through this and have a good attitude. But I'm trying to say, I know how some of these people work. And you just can't, it takes a while to change your mind. If I ask you when was the Reformation, you probably come up with 1517 as a number. No. The church has been reforming since the first day Christ died and was resurrected. And it will continue to reform. And so let's just decide that we can all be friends, do the best we can, and we agree one way, you agree another way, and that's the way it will be. So I don't think we'll come up with any compromises.
I'm going to treat that as the benediction. Thank you for sending us forth, Jerry. And I hope you come back for the organ recital. So thank you.